Okay, hello and welcome to the Chinatown Hall for the Greater Kansas City area. My name is Jack Zhang. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at KU, core faculty member for the Center for East Asian Studies and director of the KU Trade War Lab. This is the 17th Chinatown Hall organized by the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and we are one of 80 venues across the U.S. and I think some around the world holding a conversation this evening about China. First, I want to thank the Center for East Asian Studies, the International Relations Council, and the World Trade Center of Kansas City for co-sponsoring this event. This is our third year working together and to put on the local Chinatown halls. And it's wonderful working with the whole team to have this event. And thank you for allowing me to moderate. And thank you for those in the audience for joining us today. I'm going to drop into the chat the links to future upcoming events by all the co-sponsors right now. So do check out all three organizations if you're not familiar with them. There's a lot of really great programming, both virtual and in person, by all three. The theme of our town hall this evening is Chinese in America. And I want to share first a little bit about myself, because I want to give time for folks to trickle in, and because I think my family's immigration experience is fairly representative for Chinese in America. So I was born in Shanxi, Taiyuan, and immigrated with my parents in elementary school. After a stop in Queens, we settled in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where my parents worked for the university. We bought a house, had my sister in that order. And then we got our green cards and became naturalized citizens a few years later. And I think that's pretty typical of the country, Chinese Americans, Chinese America as a whole, 56% of whom are naturalized U.S. citizens, 20% are U.S. born, and 24% are non-citizens, international students and so forth. And then the majority, like myself and my sister, are millennials or Gen Z. We still have most of our relatives, all my aunts and uncles are still in China. And we, for a really long time, were not able to visit due to COVID and the zero COVID shutdown, even though we have the 10-year multi-entry visas. That's, I think, fairly typical as well. Not speaking for my family, but I personally am increasingly worried, concerned about U.S. China, competition, which is probably unavoidable and healthy. But I don't think that conflict is inevitable, or not necessarily headed in that way. I have a positive, favorable view of the U.S. I vote. I believe the best days for America are ahead. And again, I think that's pretty typical given the Pew data, which shows that for Chinese Americans, 72% view the United States favorably. And unlike I think all other Asian American groups surveyed, only 41% of Chinese Americans view China favorably. I think a lot of that is to do with the point in history that we're at, right? We're at a low point of U.S. China relations. According to the same Pew survey, 82% of Americans as a whole, all Americans view China unfavorably today. It's the highest since they began collecting that data. And I think we've all seen things in the news about, the Chinese in America are treated increasingly with suspicion and racially profiled in some cases as a result of this intensifying geopolitical competition. And according to a recent C100 survey, nearly 3 in 4 of the respondents had experienced a case of racial discrimination or race-based, racism-related vigilance in the last 12 months. But in many ways, U.S.-China ties of trade, investment, migration have never been stronger. There are 5.4 million Chinese living in America today. That's 1.6% of the population, or if you go out and meet 200 people at random in the US, 2 of them or 3 of them are going to be Chinese, right? And that includes a large number of Chinese international students, as Madelyn's going to talk about shortly. And Chinese make up the largest investors in US real estate, as Stephen's going to talk about shortly. Bilateral trade has hit a new record last year, despite the ongoing tariffs of the trade war. I can go on. But I think we've now accumulated a critical mass of folks in the audience, and I'm eager to introduce our two speakers. So we have two excellent speakers to help us make sense of this paradox of being Chinese America in these challenging times. Our first speaker is Madelyn Ross, who's worked in China-related positions in higher education and nonprofits for 30 years. She holds a BA from Princeton and an MA from Columbia, and was one of the first American students to study in China in the early 80s at Fudan University. She is currently the president of the U.S. China Education Trust. And prior to her work at USCT, she worked at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins SAIS, George Mason University, and the U.S. China Business Council. Today, Madelyn will share with us the results of a fantastic new survey, 3 decades of Chinese students in America, done in collaboration with the China Data Lab at UC San Diego. Our second speaker, Stephen Liao, is an assistant professor of political science at the University of California, Riverside, and a non-resident scholar at the 21st Century China Center at UCSD. He received his bachelor's at National Chengchi University in Taiwan and his PhD from the University of Virginia. He was also my tianbei or senpai at Nihao Center at Princeton, and his research focuses on using big administrative data to help improve our understanding of politics, the politics of economic globalization. He's published a number of articles in the top journals of our field, and today he'll be presenting some of his work on Chinese real estate investment and its impact on U.S. politics. Before we start, a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded later to the Center for East Asian Studies YouTube channel. The event will be followed by the broadcast of the national speaker, who this year is the U.S. Ambassador to China, Nick Burns. So please stay tuned for that. With that, I'll turn over to our speakers. Each will have 15 minutes to present, and I'll collect questions in the Q&A feature. You can ask questions anytime, and I'll collect those and I'll weave them together into a discussion at the end here. So that's enough from me, and thank you, and over to our speakers. Madelyn.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks to you, University of Kansas, and IRC, World Trade Center in Kansas City, for organizing this. I think it's a really important topic, and I'm glad to be here to talk about Chinese students in America. I see this as a very significant group of individuals and one that's in a rather fluid situation. Currently, there are about 290,000 Chinese students here in this country studying, and that sounds like a really high number. It is, but it's down significantly from pre-pandemic levels. And frankly, the direction that number is going to go right now is rather up in the air. So let me just jump right in. Many people don't realize how long Chinese students have been coming here. And what an important part of the higher education landscape they are. Approximately 3 million Chinese students, conservatively, from the People's Republic of China have come to study in the United States since the late 1970s. So they represent one of the largest cross-border flows of students in modern times. For years, American universities and American people welcomed them and saw this as a very positive exchange. These were top students. They brought international perspectives and culture to the campus, and they brought tuition dollars. They, in turn, benefited from a world-class education and an introduction to our society and our culture. And both the US and China benefited, I think, because we were educating future leaders who were from China but understood America, spoke our language, and knew us from the inside. So on a personal note, I'd like to add that I've worked for 20 years on U.S. China education issues at universities. As you mentioned, one is a large public university in Virginia, one is a private research university in Maryland. And at both schools, I came to know literally hundreds of Chinese students and scholars. I also came to know dozens of professors at both universities who originally came to the United States as students from China and stayed on to build their lives and academic careers here. Some returned. Whether they stayed or returned, they were productive citizens, and they were an important cultural and personal bridge between the two countries and a stabilizing force in U.S. China relations. My experience working with these hundreds of people has been and continues to be overwhelmingly positive. So I was surprised about 5 years ago when the administration began to cast a blanket suspicion on Chinese students and scholars in the United States and said things like most of them were probably here to spy and were sent by the Chinese government. This really didn't fit very well with my own experience with this group. And that's one reason that my organization, the U.S. China Education Trust, or USET, chose to do a survey of Chinese students, which I'd like to talk about. But first, I'd like to put up a few slides. And the first slide is going to give us an overview of Chinese students in this country. I hope you can see it. So in the beginning, the very first Chinese students who came here are not actually on this graph. A handful of students started coming right after normalization in 1979. At that time, virtually no one in China had US dollars, and if they did, they couldn't begin to afford American tuition. So this small number of students for the first few years were sent with Chinese government funding in priority fields related to China's modernization drive, and they were advanced graduate students. Virtually all of them returned to China because that was the terms of their funding. But very quickly, American universities realized that this was a very talented and motivated group of students, and they started to provide their own funding. So Chinese doctoral students began coming paid for by American universities, and those students had a choice, and many of them chose to stay here after completing their degrees. According to the National Science Foundation, about 90% of Chinese doctoral students have chosen to remain in the United States over the decades. In 1985, where this chart starts, there were only about 12,000 students from China in this country, and most of them, as I said, were in graduate programs. While the numbers rose gradually over the next 20 years or so, the pattern was similar. The red line shows total student numbers, and the green line down at the bottom stayed very flat for a long time because that was the undergraduate population, which was only a very tiny percentage of the total. Things started to change, however, quickly in the early 2000s as China became wealthier and more Chinese families had the means to pay for their children to study abroad. They chose to send their students in large numbers to the United States. And so the green line starts to rise and rise rapidly. And by 2010, there were more than 150,000 Chinese students in this country. By 2015, there were 300,000. You can also notice that in 2014 or so, the green line and the yellow line, which is a little bit hard to see, I apologize, cross, which it means that the number of undergraduates for the first time surpassed the number of graduate students from China here. This is really significant because college students were much younger. They were mostly paying their own way, and they were returning to China in very high numbers. The other big change you can see on this chart is in the last several years. Starting about 2016, the rate of increase slows down, and it peaks in 2019 at 372,000 Chinese students. But there's a sudden drop after that, due to the pandemic, of course, and that number has continued to fall. As I said, it's now about 290,000 students, and new numbers will be released in a few weeks from the International Institute of International Education. It's unlikely the numbers will rise very much, and I don't think they'll ever reach the peak of the pre-pandemic years, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but because the numbers had risen so rapidly over the years that it was hard to absorb all those students. But anyway, it's not clear where the number is going to go. Next slide, please. For a more personal and nuanced picture, If you can advance the slide, thanks. Let's look at the new survey that's just come out on 3 decades of Chinese students in America, which was completed in September by the U.S. China Education Trust, or USET, where I work, and the UCSD China Data Lab, which is part of the 21st Century China Center at UCSD. As I noted at the outset, the rising tensions between the US and China have put Chinese students in a negative spotlight. And USET decided to do this survey in 2022 in order to hear directly from Chinese students and to humanize the picture of Chinese students, as well as to provide a larger framework for understanding this group over the years. You can go to the next slide. As far as we know, this survey is unique in its broad scope and time frame. Most studies of Chinese students in this country focus on current students, which makes sense, or on students and alumni from one school or one region. So our survey, in contrast, went to a broad group of former students who had earned undergraduate or graduate degrees over a 30-year period, including those who stayed in the United States and those who returned to China, who were much harder to get answers from. You can find a summary of the results on USET's website, which is the first link here. And you can link directly to the detailed data survey on the UCSD website, which is below it. You might maybe put those in the chat if possible. And next slide. So here you have a snapshot of the survey takers. There were more than 400 responses, and we received a very good representation over time. So in order to compare results over time, we divided the group into 3 periods. Those who graduated before 2014, which were about 38% of the total. Those who graduated between 2014 and 2015, 2004 and 2015, when the numbers rose really rapidly. And then those who graduated between 2016 and 2021. If you go to the UCSD website, you can actually see a lot more detail here, and you can interact with the data by filtering by decade or by type of degree and a few other things. You can also see here that we had students take the survey from dozens of universities, both public, private, large, and small, all around the country. Next slide. So the survey is basically divided into 4 main sections corresponding to 4 broad questions. We began by asking how and why Chinese students come to America, and then we looked at campus life and how integrated they were. The third question was whether Chinese students had encountered negative experiences while they were here and of what type. And fourth, we asked how former Chinese students, looking back, felt about their experience studying in America. Each section of the report has data and key takeaways. My goal will be just to give you a few of the takeaways, and you can find all the results on the website. Next slide. So in part 1, the first thing that we found was that seeking a quality education was the top reason why Chinese students came to America, not surprisingly. But the strength of the response was quite remarkable. 98% of respondents said that they came to the United States for a quality, the best possible education. And what I'm showing here is our second takeaway. Merit scholarships attracted most Chinese international students, and Chinese government support was negligible. This result surprised us a little bit, but 60% of the survey takers said they received some financial support from their U.S. university. 40% had parental support, and over on the far right, less than 2% reported receiving any Chinese government funding, which seemingly contradicts the widespread notion that Chinese students are largely sent by the Chinese government. This may have been true, as I mentioned, in the early years right after normalization. but not anymore. Next slide. We now move on to the second major question, which is how they were engaging outside the classroom on campus. And by the way, some of these questions are multiple choice, which is why the number of responses is more than 100. I should have said sooner. Anyway, here we had mixed results. One clear result was over the years, Chinese students felt they had less time for socializing and needed more time studying, which would imply that they were less engaged on campus. However, the slide shown here provides another interesting perspective. It shows fairly strong levels of participation in extracurricular activities. After the most common one, which was on-campus employment, about half of the respondents said they participated in a Chinese student group or cultural organization on campus. Interestingly, that number has gone down over time. Another third of students participated in sports and about 20% in religious activities. Next slide. The third question, the third major section of the report was what type of negative experiences have they encountered? Here we looked at both political pressures and incidents of perceived discrimination. The key takeaway may not come as a surprise. Given the well-known rise in anti-Asian incidents here in the US in recent years, you can see in this graph a clear jump in Chinese students reporting discrimination from 15% in the pre-2004 group to about 30% in the middle group and 51% in the group graduating after 2016. On the website, you can also break it down into differences between undergrads and grads. Another interesting issue we explored here was the role of politics. We asked whether students felt pressured at school to express certain political views. They did, and it rose over the years. Interestingly, it came from both sides. Some students felt pressured by Americans to disavow and criticize the Chinese government. Others reported pressure from Chinese students to show greater loyalty to China. So one of our key takeaways in this section of the report was when discussing politics, Chinese international students feel caught between a rock and a hard place. Next slide. I'd like to end with a couple graphics that partially answer the fourth major question. How do Chinese students feel about their time studying in America? In this graph, you can see that things were rather contradictory. The vast majority agreed with the statement that, in general, Americans were friendly and welcoming to me. Half strongly agreed, another third somewhat agreed. But on the other hand, about 40% at the bottom said that they had felt distant from American society while they were here. And somewhat surprisingly, given the reports of rising negative experiences, we found that more than 80% of survey takers said they would choose to study in the US again if given the choice. Next slide. Finally, our 10th and last takeaway was that significant numbers of Chinese students stay connected to their US schools and friends after graduation. We approached this from several different angles, but shown in the pie chart here, you can see that a striking 40% of our respondents made financial contributions to their US university after graduating. This compares to an average annual giving rate of about 8% among US alumni. We also asked them about maintaining connections with friends and classmates from school, and about 50% said they stayed in touch with American, international, and Chinese friends. Another third stayed in touch mainly with Chinese friends, and about 15% didn't really stay in touch with friends from school. So we can take the slides off now. And just in conclusion, where does this leave us? I'd like to close with a few thoughts about larger issues raised by the survey. For several years now, Chinese students and scholars have been caught in a web of suspicion amidst rising tensions between the US and China. Overall, we think the responses in our survey should be reassuring to Americans worried about the presence of students from China. Our sample shows a group of individuals who came to the United States out of a desire for academic excellence and personal gain, and who financed their education mainly with university and family support. Despite feelings of alienation and a rise in political pressures and negative encounters, most said they had fond memories and enduring friendships from their student days in America, and they would choose to do it again if they had the choice. Our survey, of course, represents a small slice of former Chinese students in the United States, but it does track well with known trends in the larger student population. We think there's more to be learned, and in fact, we hope the report raises questions that encourage further exploration. What pressures are the students under now? How do they relate to the ones that are reported by the students in our survey? We also want to see people dig deeper into the positive and negative outcomes of current and former students to better understand the benefits and risks raised by the presence of Chinese students in American higher education. When the big picture does come into focus, and I hope it does, I think it will be clear that the United States has much to gain from Chinese students and scholars studying in America and little to fear. In fact, both sides have clearly already gained a great deal. I'm going to end there and thank you very much. Next, I'm turning it over to Professor Stephen Liao, who's going to talk about the politics of Chinese real estate investment.
See your slides, Stephen.
Oh, trying to unmute myself. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So thanks to all the organizers for the opportunity to present my research here today. I'm excited to be on this panel with Madelyn and Jack and to discuss timely issues related to China. I look forward to your comments and your questions in the Q&A. So the motivation of this, the presentation today is motivated by a couple of different observations. So first of all, there are very few economic issues that affect people like housing as personally as universally as housing. It usually represents the largest single asset for most people, and it's associated mortgage. That is one of the biggest financial assets in most countries. It has even an arguably broader impact than employment. If you think about pensioners and children, they may not seek jobs, but everyone needs a place to live. And so no example better illustrates the significance of housing as a devastating US subprime mortgage crisis. So as you can see, the globalization of housing markets through increasing foreign real estate investment activities is therefore deeply contentious. In the 1980s, the foreign real estate investment activities of four Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, introduced strong political emotions about race, wealth, and inequality in many Anglosphere markets, including the United States and Canada. In recent years, the foreign real estate investment activity of BRIC countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China, have revived many of those emotions. For example, China has become the largest foreign buyer of US homes in 2013. And so to give you a sense of what Chinese foreign real estate investment activities in the US look like in recent years, this figure plots the top foreign buyers of US residential real estate in terms of sales on the left and shares on the right. As you can see, Chinese residential real estate acquisitions grew from around $4 billion in 2009 and to over $30 billion in 2017. In fact, if you look at the year 2013, China surpassed Canada as the largest foreign buyer of residential properties in the US. So these two trends reflect two broader developments in China. The first is the start of Chinese efforts to internationalize its national currency, which is the renminbi, in the late 2000s in financial markets, international trade, and FDI. If you look at the significant acceleration since 2013, this significant acceleration coincides with the start of Chinese President Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign and increase in political risks. And so, for those of you who are not as familiar with this anti-corruption campaign, this is a nationwide anti-corruption campaign that began in December 2012 after Xi Jinping came into power. In 2014 alone, the Chinese Communist Party disciplined more than 71,000 party members. As of July 2018, more than 2,400 officials were arrested or sentenced in criminal corruption cases. So these massive crackdown led to fear of political targeting as well as asset expropriation, which triggered a massive flow of capital flows from China to the United States. And so my research leverages this particular change as an exogenous shock to capital flows to the United States. Okay, so the broader question here is then, what are the political implications when foreigners emerge as prominent buyers in domestic housing markets? So despite the increasing magnitude of Chinese foreign real estate investment as well as its political salient, we actually still know very little about the extent and ways through which foreign real estate investment shapes domestic politics in investment receiving countries. Most of the research on globalization so far has focused on labor market explanations. And I think this is an important oversight because housing can play an equal, if not even more significant role than labor markets in driving political attitudes and participation. So in my research, I hypothesized that there are three main ways that foreign real estate investment may affect politics. The first one is through material self-interest. So we can imagine how foreign real estate investment comes in, increases demand for housing, which pushes up home prices. And for homeowners, a larger home equity might enable them to be able to do more investments or increase their consumption. Overall, broader and better pocketbook conditions might increase homeowners' support for, let's say, incumbent parties. On the other hand, you can also imagine how home prices and increase in housing competition might lead to grievances among non-homeowners. So even within this mechanism, there could be opposing effects. A second set of potential mechanisms through which foreign real estate investment may affect politics is through social tropic considerations. So when foreign real estate investment comes in, it might boost local economic activities through investments and consumption. And then these expansionary effects might positively shape voters' perception of how the incumbent party is doing. There's a lot of political science research saying that local economic conditions shape voters' perspective of the national economy. And therefore, if it's going positively, then they might reward incumbent parties. A third set of mechanisms is through nativist concerns. And so you can also imagine how a massive influx of foreign real estate investment might significantly change local community ethnic composition. This might create challenges for existing group identities and group statuses. It might trigger a threat perception or anti-immigration sentiment, and also political dissatisfaction against, let's say, the incumbent party, or it could raise support for conservative parties. And so there could be a lot of different downstream political effects. Okay. So to explore these effects and to empirically test these effects, the effects of Chinese foreign real estate investment, I've looked at two different outcomes. The first is individual attitudes, and the second is national elections. Today's presentation is mainly based on summarizing some of the main findings of two of my papers, one in Nature and Human Behavior and one forthcoming in International Studies Quarterly. So to give you, before giving you an overview of the main results, one of the main key challenges or most important parts of trying to identify the effects is actually measuring exposure exposure, so local exposure to Chinese foreign real estate investment. Ideally, the most ideal measure would be getting transaction level data on every Chinese home purchase in the United States. However, this could be difficult for many reasons. For one, transaction level data is usually absent due to privacy or proprietary concerns. And also, foreigners have often used shell companies to purchase real estate, which makes measurement more difficult. And so in my research, what I've argued is that the next best option is to actually use the local population of Chinese international undergrads as an empirical proxy. And so this speaks nicely to following Madelyn's presentation on Chinese students in the United States. And so the reason this might be a good empirical proxy is because usually if you look at the Chinese international undergraduate students, they come from more affluent families, more capable of investment as compared to, let's say, Chinese graduate students who are relying on institutional funding. On the other hand, foreign real estate investment also follows affluent international students because it's well known and there's a lot of media reports how Chinese parents are buying foreign real estate to support their child's education, as well as using it for portfolio diversification. And so the implication here is that when you have communities or locales with a larger initial population before the capital flow shock, right? Those areas should attract more Chinese foreign real estate investment after the shock. And so to measure very fine-grained levels of Chinese international undergraduate students, I acquired original data through this Freedom of Information Act request on all F1, M1 students in the United States by institution and level since 2000s. And I create this inverse distance weighted population at the zip code level in 2012, which is the year before the anti-corruption campaign started. And so to give you a sense of what this measure looks like, this is a map of Los Angeles, the greater Los Angeles area. If you look at the yellow zip codes, those are places where the measure tells us that these zip codes should be more exposed to Chinese foreign real estate investment. And if you actually look up these zip codes, so I'm here in Riverside, this is actually UC Riverside, UC Irvine, UCLA. So it corresponds well with where we think most Chinese undergraduate students are in the LA area. If you look more broadly at the United States, this is a measure aggregated at the county level. If we zoom in to Kansas and look at, let's say, Lawrence County, it's also an area which is, according to these, my measure, is more exposed to Chinese foreign real estate investment. Okay, so looking at briefly going through some of the main findings. First of all, Chinese foreign real estate investment, I find that it increased local home prices. And so so this figure plots the estimated effect on home values in US dollars. And so the main takeaway points is that zip code level price effects were barely existent before the shock. So this makes sense because there weren't a lot of foreign real estate investment coming from China before the anti-corruption campaign. So comparing 2012 prices to 2011 prices, there wasn't much of a statistical difference in prices. There was a jump immediately after in 2013 compared to 2012. And so this suggests that the effects mainly stem from capital coming because of the anti-corruption campaign and not just the presence of having Chinese undergrads in those zip codes in the first place. So this is mainly the effect of capital and investments. Overall, the results show that high exposure zip codes saw a larger increase in home values, about 0.5% in 2013 to about 2.65% in 2020. And so if you think about a typical $500,000 house, it corresponds to about a $13,000 larger increase in home prices. The second main set of results is looking at effects on attitudes, which Jack mentioned initially as we started the panel. What I find during this period, 2012 and 2014, is that increased exposure to Chinese foreign real estate investment actually reduced anti-immigration attitudes. And so what I find is that, I find with my co-authors is that increased exposure reduces anti-immigration attitudes by about 0.5 percentage points, which corresponds to about 13% of education. A lot of political science research shows that education is one of the most strongest predictors of anti-immigration attitudes. And so this effect is about 30% of that effect. Well, I think what is interesting about the scope condition here is that if you think about 2012 to 2014, it is a period where the United States is just recovering from the housing market crash. So at the local level, in many communities, many houses were abandoned. There was stagnant economies, and it's starting to rebound in 2012. And so when foreign real estate investment came in with from China, it helped a lot of these communities increase economic activities. And so, if you think of trying to explore what is driving this attitudinal effect, what we test in the paper is it pocketbook considerations, or is it because of some communotropic or social tropic effect? What we find is that there's little evidence for a pocketbook explanation. In fact, if you look at this panel on the left, in fact, non-homeowners had a larger decrease in anti-immigration attitudes than homeowners, which suggests it's not about homeowners and their asset or equity increases. However, these two estimates, they're not statistically significant from each other, so there's not quite of a difference, which suggests that pocketbook considerations are probably not driving this. Instead, if you look at zip codes and their, let's say, employment rate or median household income, or the number of business establishments, or the number of new vehicle registrations, zip codes with higher exposure all saw increased employment, income, establishments, new car buying, which suggests that the evidence is more consistent with this economic boost in local community, and therefore that helped reduce anti-immigration attitudes. So more consistent with communotropic considerations that exposure strengthened respondents' local economy. The second the second paper and the main results looking at electoral votes is that Chinese foreign real estate investment reduced the Democratic Party vote shares. And so what we see is that if you look at the period of presidential elections before the shock and before the influx of Chinese foreign real estate investment, there wasn't quite much of a difference between high exposure counties and low exposure counties in terms of changes in Democratic vote shares. However, since 2012 December and then the influx of Chinese FREI, we actually see larger negative effects for the Democratic Party in both the 2016 election compared to 2012 and the 2020 election compared to 2012. The effects are approximately 1 percentage point larger decrease in Democratic vote shares, two-party Democratic vote share in high Chinese foreign real estate investment exposure counties. Substantively, the overall effect is about 10% of population density. So one of the main strongest predictor of county level vote shares for the Democratic Party is how dense is the population. Usually denser places are more likely to vote. Big cities are likely to vote for the Democratic Party. And this effect is about 1/10 of that effect. Again, exploring the mechanisms, I find that the larger the initial white population in that county, this actually magnifies the negative effect for the Democratic Party in both elections. If you look at bachelor's degree or above, the larger the population of bachelor degree educated population, that actually attenuates the negative effect. So these results kind of point to more of the nativist consideration. Results are more consistent with this pro-right nativism effect. There are a lot more findings in the papers. If you're interested, I encourage you to take a deeper look. But to kind of summarize and conclude, a lot of people have talked about the China shock, especially related to trade. In my research, I think it's also important to look at the China shock in terms of local housing markets. One of the summarizing the main findings, in the period where the U.S. housing market was recovering, increased exposure to Chinese foreign real estate investment actually reduced anti-immigration attitudes. But after the U.S. housing market recovered, around since 16 and 17, the effect has actually been in the opposite direction. So pro-conservative electoral effects after the housing market recovered. I think this is actually a very complicated issue to study because there are so many cross-cutting material and cultural effects at work. So you can think about a native respondent or native resident who is in a community that experiences increase in Chinese foreign real estate investment. And therefore, you can imagine on one hand, equity going up is great, but also maybe the community ethnic composition is changing so much, which creates these downstream effects on attitudes and political behavior. One of the very, very important implications, I think, from the first paper is that when people observe local economic benefits, it may actually counter a negative opinion about certain countries, especially towards China. What might be a little bit more concerning is that we actually see a decrease in Chinese foreign real estate investments since 2017. This could be due to a lot of different reasons. Capital controls from China, limiting outflow. It could also be US and China trade war. And then 2020, you have COVID-19. So this actually reduces the chance for locals to observe local economic benefits. And then this corresponds with this increasing trend in restrictions on foreign buying that we have seen a lot in the news this year, especially, for example, legislation in Florida. And so to wrap up, this is just a figure that I took from a recent report. 15 states enacted legislation regulating foreign ownership. A lot of these now require mandate disclosures, direct prohibitions, or disinvestments. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to talk more about other details and answer questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen, Madelyn, both really insightful, data-rich presentations. Encourage audience members, if you have questions, please enter it into the Q&A, and I'll weave it into the queue, and I'll start with one that I think maybe both of you guys can address. I'll go to Madelyn first, though, which is this, there's this thread between, I guess, interests, right, and exposure to of Americans to Chinese on the one hand, and then sort of nativism and backlash sort of on the other, right? And we see it both in the work that Stephen's just talked about with your neighbors, right? Are they Chinese or not? And then we see it in you, the survey you're talking about, Madelyn, your dorm mates, I guess, your fellow students, right? Has proximity sort of made Americans and Chinese closer and see more more understanding of each other, right? Or is the opposite true? And maybe this is like a Twitter effect that we only hear the most extreme voices, but you hear a lot of attitudes towards Chinese, stereotypes about bad behavior, owning cars, cheating in exams, right, rising over the course of this increase in Chinese students. And then on the other hand, Chinese attitudes towards the U.S., very prominent kind of, the U.S. is dangerous and, not as developed as you think, right? So you see a lot of those narratives emerge as well. How do you guys, so Madelyn first, like, how do you make sense of that, right? The proximity and greater exposure, what is the net effect, in I guess, education first?
That's a kind of difficult question, but let me take a crack at it. So mostly on the campuses that I have worked, familiarity with Chinese student presence has been generally a positive thing. And Chinese students have, I knew a lot of undergraduates at George Mason University, undergraduate students, and if you made an effort to get them to come out and engage in activities, it was really had a positive impact, and friendships formed, marriages, all sorts of things. But that's not to say that everything is rosy and positive. And especially in recent years, you hear stories about Chinese students on campus who are trying to limit discussion or to bully other Chinese students. And also there was, especially in the go-go period of the mid-2000s, Chinese students who were, as you say, driving fancy cars and, alienating students. I didn't see a lot of that where I was, but I heard about it at some big public universities, Midwest, other places. So anyway, what I want to say about the current reports are that, democracy is a messy thing, and campuses are supposed to have debates and be a center of intellectual ferment. So as U.S. China tensions rise, you are going to have a clash between students who are pro-China, anti-China, and Chinese students who are feeling very, protective of their national feelings. And sometimes things go wrong and students behave in ways that, especially international students, sometimes it's their very first experience of academic freedom and unfettered debate, and they're not really used to it, and they try to, silence other groups, and they think they can. But the responsibility is in part, I think, primarily on the university then to educate international students about the rights and responsibilities of academic freedom in America, what you can and can't do. You have a right to express your opinion. You have a right to be very vocal, but you don't have a right to intimidate other students. You don't have a right to do a lot of different things. So democracy is messy, campuses are messy, but I've seen a lot of positive interaction, and there's both sides.
Thank you, Madelyn. Well put. Stephen, to you on that same question of does familiarity, this is kind of the takeaway from your two papers, right? Do you, on balance then, do we see familiarity breeding contempt or familiarity breeding greater understanding, and or is, it's conditional as you argue?
Yeah, so it's a very difficult question. I think it depends on how close you define proximity. So like on one hand, if there's more contact between dorm mates, you're very close with your neighbors, you make friends, that reduces a lot of the stereotypical biases that people might have. But then if you are seeing a lot of money coming in or people coming in that are at the county level or other parts competing for with you on the labor market, that might generate threat perception. So there might be some mismatch based on how proximate are these interactions, and also depending on what period. As I mentioned, when the U.S. housing market was recovering, that period, lots of money coming in, stimulating the economy, that generated net positive effects on attitudes. But when you have a period where housing prices are already high and more money coming in, that might create competition, which might lead to more negative attitudes. So I think there's a lot of complications here, and depend on proximity, how close, and context.
Thanks, Stephen. And before I let you go, could you address this technical question by Dan, which is, do you, in your data, do you distinguish from mainlanders and Chinese from Taiwanese and Hong Kongers? How do you handle that in your work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So this data is purely based on Chinese mainland undergraduate students. With the FOIA data, I could distinguish their country of birth and country of citizenship. So this is purely based on Chinese mainland.
Thank you. And turning back to Madelyn, could you answer this question as well? So this is mainland students we're talking about, right, in the survey?
Correct. We say very clearly in the report that when we use the term Chinese students or Chinese international students, we are specifically talking about students from the People's Republic of China.
And turning to another question by an anonymous audience member, so how can exposure be increased if nativism and anti-Asian sort of sentiment is on the rise in the U.S.? How do we reconcile these apparently sort of opposing forces without compromising the safety of Chinese expatriates, Chinese students? I'm guessing the gist of the question is, I guess, should Chinese, maybe I'm interpreting this, should Chinese international students continue to come here to study, given how bad things are turning? Do you have a thought or reaction to that?
So, Madelyn,
Jack?
go ahead.
Yes, I think they should. I think we should deal with them as humans and not as sort of some vague amorphous Chinese vector of Chinese influence. In other words, if there's negative incidents, deal with them as individuals. There's many positive incidents. I would say for every negative incident, there's more positive incidents. So the important thing is to humanize the situation and deal with individuals rather than stereotypes.
Stephen, did you have a thought on this point earlier?
Yeah, so I think that echoing Madelyn's point, humans, more interactions, I believe that can help reduce a lot of negative attitudes, but also these Chinese students, they also bring a lot of economic benefits to different levels of community, county, states. And so I think like more international students would generate positive effects.
I think we have time for one last question. This is from Pearson, and I'm going to expand on it. So the question is, will China's own domestic real estate sort of challenges, right? The potential collapse of the real estate market and other in other ways the Chinese economy is not doing so good recently, right? How will that impact foreign investment that they're going to make in the U.S. and to Madelyn as well? How's that going to impact sort of the flow of students coming in for the next for the next few years? Go ahead, Stephen first.
Yeah, so in general, I think the downturn in China will lead to slower foreign real estate investment. And plus, since 2017, there are significant capital controls. So China is limiting the outflow of money. And so as you saw in my figure in terms of trends, recent foreign real estate investment since 17 has gone down. It has rebounded a little bit since the pandemic, but it still hasn't recovered to the level that we saw at the peak.
And do you think that'll make things better, like Chinese attitudes of Americans towards Chinese, right? Your research will show that'll help things mellow out or make things worse, as you hinted.
So absent the local economic benefits, I think that would make things worse.
Okay, thank you. And Madelyn, thoughts on kind of the trends of future Chinese students coming to the U.S.?
I think that the economic downturn in China has a bit of a mixed impact. Of course, it makes paying American tuition difficult for some families, but I think there's still a fairly high demand for graduate studies in particular, because the job market in China right now is really poor for college grads. So college grads are looking for somewhere to go and that will really boost their job prospects and maybe even give them another option after they graduate. So that's another effect.
Thank you both so much. I wish we had more time. I have personally so many more questions for you both, but I want to turn things over to Melissa, if Melissa is able to speak to close this out. And I want to throw this up here and just say a few things. One, if you are a student from the business school, that's your QR code for getting credit for this event. And the other QR code is there's going to be a debrief after the national broadcast that our friends at the U.S. Heartland China Association is doing. So if you want to register for that event, please scan the other QR code. But over to Melissa. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Jack. Again, it's my pleasure to close out tonight's local programming on behalf of the World Trade Center Kansas City, the International Relations Council, and of course, the University of Kansas Center for East Asian Studies. Thank you once again to Madelyn and Stephen for providing your insight, and thank you to Jack for moderating this discussion. As you said, there's a lot of questions that we could have kept going on, so wish we could have kept you on longer. But we hope today's programming has given you a deeper understanding of Chinese in America, especially from an education and a real estate perspective. Once again, thank you for joining us for the local program this evening, and please stick around. We hope you stick around for the national broadcast featuring the U.S. Ambassador to China, Nicholas Prince.